What if I told you that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the shadows when injustice rears its ugly head? What happens when a simple breakfast becomes a battleground for human dignity, and leather-clad strangers become the cavalry you never saw coming? This is the extraordinary true story of how one morning in a small southern town changed everything, and why the ending will restore your faith in humanity when you least expect it. The morning mist hung low over Ashwood, Tennessee, like a veil hiding the town's deepest secrets. In a modest ranch house on Maple Street, 82-year-old Joe Thompson stirred in his bed as the first golden rays of sunlight crept through his bedroom curtains. The old floorboards creaked their familiar morning song as his feet touched the cool hardwood, a sound that had greeted him every dawn for the past 15 years since he'd moved to this quiet corner of America. But Joe Thompson wasn't just any retiree enjoying his golden years. Behind those kind, weathered eyes lay stories that could fill volumes, stories of courage under fire, of brotherhood forged in the crucible of war, of sacrifices made in distant lands for the freedom others took for granted. As he shuffled toward his bathroom mirror, the reflection staring back at him told a tale of 8 decades lived with purpose, dignity, and an unwavering belief in the promise of America. The ritual was always the same. Cold water splashed on his face to chase away the remnants of dreams filled with memories both beautiful and haunting. Joe's morning routine had been honed by decades of military discipline, precise, purposeful, never rushed. As he reached for his electric razor, his eyes caught sight of the framed photograph on the bathroom counter, a young, proud soldier in crisp army greens, standing at attention with eyes full of hope and determination. That young man had believed wholeheartedly in the American dream. He had enlisted not just to serve his country, but to prove that men like him, black men from small southern towns, belonged in the uniform, belonged in the fight for freedom, belonged in the America they were helping to defend. The contrast between that hopeful young soldier and the man in the mirror was stark, not just in age, but in the wisdom that comes from decades of fighting battles both overseas and at home. Joe's hands, now marked with liver spots and crossed with prominent veins, moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared for another day. These hands had once held rifles in defense of democracy, had signed enlistment papers with a trembling excitement, had saluted flags in ceremonies both grand and somber. They had also been clenched in frustration more times than he cared to remember, in diners that refused him service, at job interviews that ended before they began, in moments when his country's promise felt like a cruel joke. But this morning felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight seemed particularly golden as it filtered through his bedroom window. Or maybe it was the sound of children's laughter drifting from the nearby elementary school playground. Whatever it was, Joe felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in months, a desire to break from routine, to try something new. His usual breakfast spot, Millie's Diner on 4th Street, was closed for renovations. Joe had been a regular there for over a decade, his presence as predictable as the sunrise. The waitresses knew his order by heart: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, crisp bacon, and black coffee that could wake the dead. It was a comfortable routine, a safe harbor in a world that hadn't always been welcoming to men who looked like him. But today, that closure felt less like an inconvenience and more like an invitation. Joe had heard whispers around town about another establishment, the Cozy Corner Café. According to Mrs. Henderson from down the street, they served the fluffiest pancakes in 3 counties and coffee strong enough to raise the dead. The thought of their supposedly legendary breakfast special, scrambled eggs with locally sourced herbs, thick-cut bacon, and hash browns crispy enough to make grown men weep, made his stomach growl with anticipation. As Joe selected his clothes for the day, his movements took on the careful deliberation of a man preparing for more than just breakfast. From his closet, he chose his best slacks, charcoal gray with a crease sharp enough to cut paper, and a powder blue button-down shirt that complemented his mahogany skin tone. But the centerpiece of his ensemble was the jacket he lifted from its special hanger with reverence bordering on ceremony. This wasn't merely clothing. It was a testament to a life lived in service to something greater than oneself. The dark blue fabric was adorned with medals that told stories of valor, sacrifice, and brotherhood. The Purple Heart, earned when shrapnel from an enemy mortar found its mark during a night patrol in Vietnam. The Bronze Star, recognition for actions he rarely spoke about but which had saved the lives of 3 fellow soldiers. The Combat Infantry Badge, proof that he had faced the enemy and stood his ground when lesser men might have faltered. As Joe fastened each button of the jacket, he felt the familiar weight of those medals, not just their physical presence, but the emotional burden they carried. Each piece of metal and ribbon represented not just his own service, but the memory of friends who hadn't made it home, the dreams of young men cut short by war, the hope that their sacrifices would create a better world for future generations. The final touch was his military cap, worn soft by decades of wear but still maintaining its dignified shape. As Joe placed it on his gray-crowned head, adjusting it to sit at precisely the correct angle, he was transported back through the years. He could almost hear the drill sergeant's bark, feel the nervous energy of basic training, smell the diesel fuel and gun oil that permeated every military installation he'd ever called home. Walking to his front door, Joe caught his reflection in the hallway mirror one last time. The man staring back at him looked every inch the soldier he had once been, shoulders square, posture erect, bearing proud. The years may have added lines to his face and silver to his hair, but they hadn't diminished the dignity that radiated from his very core. The morning air was crisp and clean as Joe stepped onto his front porch, carrying with it the promise of spring and the faint aroma of honeysuckle from Mrs. Patterson's garden next door. Ashwood was awakening around him, garage doors rumbling open as neighbors prepared for their daily commutes, school buses beginning their routes, the familiar rhythm of a small town coming to life. As Joe walked down Maple Street toward Maine, he practiced the art of small-town navigation he had mastered over the years. A warm nod to Mr. Ellis, the retired postal worker who was already tending his prized rose garden. A friendly wave to young Tommy Peterson, racing to catch the school bus with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. A respectful tip of his cap to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was sweeping her front steps with the methodical precision of someone who took pride in maintaining her small corner of the world. The responses he received painted a familiar portrait of his place in this community. Some neighbors returned his greetings with genuine warmth. These were the people who had taken the time to know Joe as more than just the elderly black man who lived alone on Maple Street. They knew about his military service, his quiet dignity, his tendency to shovel driveways for elderly neighbors without being asked. But others offered only perfunctory acknowledgments or, worse, averted their eyes entirely, as if his very presence made them uncomfortable. Joe had long ago learned to read these subtle social signals, developed a sixth sense for the undercurrents of acceptance and rejection that flowed through every interaction. It was a skill no man should have to master, but one that had kept him safe and sane through decades of navigating a world where his uniform commanded respect abroad while his skin color invited suspicion at home. The walk to the cozy corner took him through the heart of Ashwood's downtown district, a collection of buildings that told the story of American small-town evolution. The old hardware store with its creaking wooden floors and the scent of oil and metal shavings. The family-owned pharmacy where Mr. Chang still filled prescriptions by hand and knew every customer by name. The barber shop where local men had gathered for decades to solve the world's problems one haircut at a time. But it was the newer establishments that caught Joe's attention this morning. The trendy coffee shop that catered to the growing population of young professionals who had discovered Ashwood's small-town charm. The boutique clothing store with its carefully curated window displays aimed at attracting tourists from the nearby interstate. These businesses represented change, progress, the evolution of a town trying to balance its traditional roots with the demands of a modern economy. The question that nagged at Joe as he walked was whether this evolution extended beyond storefronts and sidewalks into the hearts and minds of Ashwood's residents. Had the passage of time and the gradual diversification of the town's population created genuine change? Or were the old prejudices still lurking beneath a veneer of politeness and progress? The cozy corner cafe sat at the intersection of Main and Church Streets, occupying a corner building that had housed various businesses over the decades. The current iteration was charming in its deliberate quaintness, large plate glass windows that offered a view of the bustling interior, a hand-painted sign that swayed gently in the morning breeze, flower boxes filled with cheerful blooms that added splashes of color to the brick facade. Through those windows, Joe could see the cafe was doing steady business for a Sunday morning. Families occupied several of the larger tables, children's voices adding a musical counterpoint to the general buzz of conversation. Couples huddled over steaming mugs of coffee, some reading newspapers together, others engaged in the intimate conversations that define long-term relationships. Solo diners sat at the counter, some absorbed in books, others content to watch the world wake up through the cafe's windows. But it was one particular group that caught Joe's attention and gave him a moment's pause. In the far corner, occupying a cluster of tables pushed together, sat a group of bikers. Their leather jackets and imposing presence created a stark contrast to the cafe's cozy atmosphere. Beards ranged from neatly trimmed to impressively wild. Tattoos decorated visible skin, and their patches told stories of long rides and fierce loyalties. Joe found himself hesitating on the sidewalk, his hand poised on the cafe's door handle. A lifetime of experience had taught him to be cautious, to read situations carefully before committing to a course of action. The presence of the bikers didn't necessarily signal danger, but it added an unknown variable to what Joe had hoped would be a peaceful morning meal. Taking a deep breath and drawing upon the courage that had carried him through military service and civilian life alike, Joe pushed open the door. The bell above chimed his arrival with a cheerful jingle, and he was immediately enveloped by the intoxicating aroma of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and something sweet baking in the kitchen, possibly the cinnamon rolls he had heard Mrs. Henderson rave about. The interior of the cozy corner was everything its name promised. Warm yellow walls were adorned with local artwork and vintage photographs that told the story of Ashwood's history. Mismatched tables and chairs gave the place a comfortable, lived-in feel that spoke of countless meals shared and conversations held. The worn wooden floors bore the scuff marks and patina that come from years of faithful service, and the gentle hum of conversation created an atmosphere of community and belonging. A young woman approached him almost immediately, her name tag identifying her as Sarah and her smile radiating the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be faked. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with kind eyes and a manner that reminded Joe poignantly of his own granddaughter, the same gentle confidence, the same natural ability to make others feel welcome. "Good morning, sir," Sarah said, her voice carrying just a hint of the local accent that marked her as Ashwood born and raised. "Welcome to the cozy corner. First time visiting us?" Joe nodded, returning her smile with one of his own. There was something infectious about her cheerful demeanor that began to ease the tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Yes, it is. I've heard wonderful things about your breakfast." "Well, you heard right," Sarah replied with obvious pride. "Would you prefer a table or a spot at the counter? We've got a lovely booth by the window if you'd like to watch the world go by while you eat." The booth she indicated was indeed perfect, positioned to catch the morning light while offering a clear view of both the street outside and the cafe's interior. Joe accepted her offer with gratitude, settling into the comfortable vinyl seating with a small sigh of contentment. This was exactly what he had hoped for, a peaceful spot to enjoy breakfast while observing the gentle rhythm of small-town Sunday morning life. As Sarah placed a well-worn menu before him, Joe couldn't help but notice the care with which the cafe had been maintained. The table was spotless, the silverware gleamed, and even the small flower in its simple vase looked fresh and lovingly tended. These details spoke of pride in the establishment, of owners who understood that a restaurant was more than just a place to consume food, it was a gathering place for the community, a home away from home where memories were made and relationships nurtured. "Can I start you off with some coffee?" Sarah asked, already reaching for the pot she carried. "It's a special blend we get from a roaster up in Nashville, supposed to be smooth enough to drink black but rich enough to wake the dead." Joe chuckled at her description. "That sounds perfect. I've been drinking my coffee black for so long. I'm not sure I'd know what to do with cream and sugar anymore." As Sarah poured the steaming dark liquid into his mug, the rich aroma rose to greet him like an old friend. Joe wrapped his weathered hands around the warm ceramic, savoring both the heat and the anticipation of that first sip. Coffee had been his constant companion through decades of early morning formations, long nights on patrol, and countless quiet moments when he needed something familiar to anchor him to home. "Take your time looking over the menu," Sarah said kindly. "I'll check back in a few minutes to see if you're ready to order." Alone with his thoughts and his coffee, Joe allowed himself to truly absorb his surroundings. The café was a symphony of sounds and sights that spoke of a thriving local business. The hiss and clatter from the kitchen suggested a busy line cook working at peak efficiency. Conversations rose and fell like gentle waves, creating a backdrop of human connection that was both soothing and energizing. His eyes inevitably drifted back to the group of bikers in the corner. They were engaged in animated conversation, their laughter occasionally rising above the general din of the cafe. Despite their intimidating appearance, Joe couldn't help but notice the easy camaraderie between them, the way they included a younger member who couldn't have been more than 25 in their discussions, the respect they showed when one of their number was speaking. These observations triggered memories from Joe's own military service, the brotherhood forged in shared hardship, the way men from vastly different backgrounds could find common ground in their commitment to something larger than themselves. Perhaps, he mused, these bikers weren't so different from the soldiers he had served alongside. Different uniforms, different missions, but possibly the same underlying values of loyalty and mutual support. Joe's contemplation was interrupted by movement from the kitchen. The swinging door burst open with a bang, and a man emerged who could only be the owner or manager. He was in his late 40s, with a shaved head that gleamed under the cafe's lights and arms that suggested he was no stranger to physical work. His eyes swept across the dining room with the practiced gaze of someone assessing his domain, checking on customer satisfaction and operational efficiency. For a moment, the man's expression was pleasant, even welcoming. As he surveyed his establishment, Joe watched as his gaze moved from table to table, a nod of satisfaction here, a mental note about a customer's needs there. This was clearly someone who took pride in his business and cared about providing good service to his patrons. But then the man's eyes fell upon Joe, and something shifted. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a hardening around the eyes, a tightening of facial muscles, a transformation from welcoming proprietor to something far less friendly. Joe had seen this look countless times before, and his heart sank as he recognized it for what it was, the expression of someone who had looked at him and seen not an individual, not a fellow human being, not even a potential customer, but simply a problem to be solved. The weight of this realization settled over Joe like a familiar, unwelcome blanket. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that this new cafe might represent the kind of progress he had dreamed of during his years of service. That maybe, in this small corner of the world, he could simply be seen as an elderly man looking for a pleasant breakfast rather than as an unwelcome presence requiring management. Joe's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around his coffee mug as he watched the owner disappear back into the kitchen. The sounds that emerged were different now, muffled voices, urgent tones, the kind of heated discussion that suggested conflict and decision-making. Joe didn't need to hear the specific words to understand what was likely being discussed. His decades of experience had given him an unwelcome expertise in reading these situations. Despite his growing unease, Joe remained seated, his military training and personal dignity combining to keep his posture straight and his demeanor calm. He had faced enemy fire, navigated hostile territories, and endured discrimination in forms both subtle and overt. Whatever was about to unfold, he would meet it with the same courage and grace that had carried him through 8 decades of life's challenges. The kitchen door swung open again, and the owner emerged with the purposeful stride of someone who had made up his mind. Joe took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and prepared himself for what he suspected was coming. The peaceful Sunday morning he had envisioned was about to become something entirely different, another test of his resolve. Another moment when he would need to choose between dignity and discretion, between standing his ground and avoiding confrontation. As the man approached his table, Joe looked up to meet his gaze directly. Whatever was about to happen, it would not catch him cowering or unprepared. The young soldier who had enlisted decades ago with hope in his heart might have aged, but he had not lost the strength of character that had sustained him through war and its aftermath. The confrontation that would define this Sunday morning was about to begin, and Joe Thompson was ready to face it with all the courage and dignity he had cultivated over a lifetime of standing up for what was right, even when, especially when, it came at great personal cost. The owner, whose name tag identified him as Frank, stopped at Joe's table with the barely controlled energy of a man wrestling with his own demons. His jaw was clenched tight, and Joe could see a vein pulsing at his temple, signs of internal conflict that spoke of a decision made against better judgment, driven by prejudices that ran deeper than logic or business sense. "We're full up today," Frank said, his voice carrying a tremor that betrayed his nervousness despite his attempt at authority. "You'll have to leave." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Joe felt the familiar sting of discrimination, a pain that never quite dulled, no matter how many times he experienced it. He glanced around the cafe, noting the empty tables and vacant spots at the counter that gave the lie to Frank's claim. The contradiction was so obvious it was almost insulting, as if Frank believed Joe was too naive or too intimidated to notice. "I'm sorry," Joe replied, his voice steady and measured. "But there appear to be several open seats. Is there perhaps a waiting list? Or a reservation system I'm not aware of?" Joe's question was reasonable, polite, giving Frank an opportunity to back down from this confrontation with dignity intact. But sometimes, when prejudice has taken root in a person's heart, reason becomes the enemy and dignity a luxury they can't afford. Frank's face reddened, and his voice rose slightly as he doubled down on his position. "I said we're full. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. You need to leave now." The exchange had begun to draw attention from other patrons. Joe was acutely aware of the shifting dynamics in the cafe, conversations becoming quieter as people strained to listen, heads turning in their direction, the atmosphere changing from peaceful morning comfort to tense anticipation. This was no longer a private confrontation but a public moment that would define not just Joe's morning, but potentially his place in this community. Joe slowly rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and dignified despite the humiliation coursing through his veins. Standing brought him to his full height, and despite his age, he still cut an impressive figure, shoulders back, head held high, every inch the soldier he had once been and in many ways still was. "Sir," Joe said, his voice carrying clearly through the now quiet cafe, "I'm not looking for any trouble. I simply want to have breakfast like any other customer." There was something in Joe's tone, a combination of patience, dignity, and quiet strength that seemed to unnerve Frank even further. Perhaps it was the contrast between Joe's calm demeanor and his own agitated state. Or maybe it was the growing awareness that their confrontation was being witnessed by a room full of people. Whatever the cause, Frank's next words crossed a line from mere discrimination into overt racism. "Your kind isn't welcome here," Frank snarled, his voice now loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear clearly. "This is a respectable establishment." A collective gasp rippled through the cafe as Frank's words landed like a slap across the face of common decency. The mask had been removed, the pretense abandoned. This was no longer about being full or reserving the right, this was naked prejudice laid bare for all to see. Joe felt the familiar cocktail of emotions that accompanied such moments: hurt, anger, disappointment, and a bone-deep weariness at the realization that some battles never seem to end. But alongside these negative feelings was something else, a quiet pride in his own conduct, in his refusal to respond to hatred with hatred, to meet ignorance with ignorance. Reaching into his wallet, Joe extracted his military identification card, a small piece of plastic that represented decades of service, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the ideals of freedom and equality. He held it up for Frank and the gathered crowd to see, his hands steady despite the emotions churning within him. "I've served this country for over 30 years, Joe said, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience and earned authority. "I've bled for it, lost friends for it, and dedicated my life to defending the freedoms that allow establishments like this to exist." The impact of Joe's words was immediate and powerful. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly disturbed by the contrast between Frank's behavior and Joe's dignity. Sarah, the young waitress, stood frozen near the counter, her face a mask of horror at what was unfolding in her workplace. Her hand gripped her order pad so tightly her knuckles had turned white, and Joe could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. Frank, perhaps realizing he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, nevertheless pressed forward with the desperate energy of someone who had committed to a course of action and couldn't find a way back. "I don't care what you did," he said, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of maintaining his hostility in the face of Joe's quiet dignity. "You're not welcome here. Get out before I call the police." The threat of police involvement added another layer of tension to an already volatile situation. Joe knew all too well how such encounters could escalate, how the presence of law enforcement could transform a civil rights issue into a potentially dangerous confrontation. The weight of decades of similar threats, decades of having his patriotism questioned, decades of being made to feel like a stranger in his own country, settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. For a moment, Joe was tempted to fight back, to escalate this confrontation into something bigger and more public. The soldier in him wanted to stand his ground, to force Frank and everyone else in the cafe to confront the ugliness of their prejudices. But the older, wiser man he had become knew that sometimes dignity required strategic retreat, that living to fight another day was more important than winning any single battle. With a heavy heart and shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of history, Joe turned toward the door. As he walked, he was acutely aware of the eyes upon him, some sympathetic, some indifferent, and a few that seemed to agree with Frank's actions. The diversity of reactions served as a painful reminder of how divided the community remained, how much work was still needed to create the kind of inclusive society he had dreamed of during his years of service. Just as Joe's hand touched the door handle, ready to step out into the morning sunlight and leave this humiliation behind him, an unexpected sound filled the cafe. It was the scraping of chairs against the floor, not just one or two, but many, creating a chorus of movement that caused everyone to turn and look. The group of bikers, who had been quietly observing the confrontation from their corner table, were rising to their feet. Their movement was coordinated but not rushed, purposeful but not threatening. Their leader, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and intelligent eyes, stepped forward from the group with the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. Joe paused, his hand still on the door handle, curiosity overcoming his desire to escape. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted once again, the tension taking on a different quality as everyone waited to see what these unexpected participants would bring to an already charged situation. The biker leader approached with measured steps, his gaze moving between Joe and Frank with the assessing look of someone taking the measure of a situation before acting. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an unmistakable note of authority that demanded attention. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Frank directly, "but we couldn't help but overhear your conversation with this gentleman. We have something to say about it." Frank, who had seemed so confident in his confrontation with Joe, now appeared decidedly less sure of himself. The presence of multiple bikers, their leather jackets and imposing demeanor, had clearly shifted the power dynamics in ways he hadn't anticipated. His eyes darted nervously between the biker leader and his companions, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "This is none of your business," Frank stammered, trying to maintain his authority while clearly feeling outmatched by this new development. "This is between me and him." The biker leader's expression remained calm, but there was steel in his voice when he replied. "Actually, it became our business the moment you decided to disrespect a fellow veteran in public." The word veteran hung in the air like a revelation, and Joe felt a surge of surprise and recognition. These men weren't just random bikers who happened to witness discrimination, they were fellow soldiers, brothers in arms who understood the meaning of service and sacrifice. "That's right," the leader continued, reaching into his leather jacket. Frank tensed visibly, clearly expecting trouble, but what emerged was not a weapon but a worn wallet. From it, the biker extracted his own military identification, holding it up for all to see. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, United States Army, retired, served 3 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. A murmur rippled through the cafe as the implications of this revelation sank in. One by one, the other bikers stepped forward, each displaying their own military credentials or rolling up sleeves to reveal tattoos that told stories of service in different branches of the armed forces. The image of these rough-looking men was being transformed before everyone's eyes. They weren't outsiders or troublemakers, but veterans who had answered their country's call to service. "We've served alongside men and women of every race, religion, and background," Mike continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. We've shared foxholes with people who look like this gentleman, trusted them to watch our backs, mourned when we lost them, and celebrated when we all made it home. What you just did isn't just wrong, it's a slap in the face to everything we fought for. The power of Mike's words was undeniable, and Joe felt emotion swelling in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Here, in this small-town cafe where he had expected to face discrimination alone, he had found unexpected allies, brothers he hadn't known existed who were willing to stand up for principles that transcended race, age, or background. Frank, realizing he was now facing not just one elderly black man but a group of military veterans, became even more defensive and desperate. I don't care who you are or what you did, he said, his voice rising to a near shout. This is my establishment, and I decide who gets served. All of you can get out right now, or I'm calling the police. Mike's response was measured but carried the weight of absolute conviction. You do that, he said calmly. Call them. We'll be happy to explain to the officers exactly what kind of discrimination we witnessed here today. We'll also be happy to explain to every news outlet, social media platform, and veteran organization in the state what kind of establishment you're running. The threat was implicit but powerful. In an age of social media and instant communication, Frank's actions could be broadcast far beyond the confines of Ashwood, bringing scrutiny and consequences he clearly hadn't considered. The calculated nature of Mike's response spoke of a man who understood how to wage battles on multiple fronts, who had learned to use strategy as well as strength. But first, Mike continued, turning his attention to Joe. We owe this gentleman an apology on behalf of our community. Sir, what you experienced here today is not representative of how veterans should treat each other, or how any decent person should treat a fellow human being. Joe, who had remained silent during this exchange, felt a lump forming in his throat. The validation, the support, the simple acknowledgement of his humanity and his service meant more than he could easily express. For decades, he had fought these battles alone, sustained only by his own inner strength and the knowledge that he was fighting for something larger than himself. To find allies, especially in such an unexpected form, was both surprising and deeply moving. Thank you, Joe managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't have to do this. You could have just minded your own business. Mike shook his head firmly. No, sir. When we see injustice, especially against a fellow veteran, it becomes our business. We took an oath to defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Discrimination and hatred are enemies of everything this country is supposed to stand for. The confrontation in the cafe had now drawn the attention of virtually every patron. Some were clearly moved by the bikers' intervention, nodding in agreement and showing visible support for Joe. Others appeared uncomfortable with the situation, perhaps confronting their own prejudices for the first time. A few seemed to agree with Frank's position, their faces set in disapproving frowns that spoke of deep-seated biases resistant to challenge. Frank, realizing that the situation had spiraled far beyond his control, made one last desperate attempt to reassert his authority. Fine, he said, his voice cracking with strain. But I want all of you out of here right now. You're disturbing my other customers. Mike looked around the cafe, taking in the various reactions of the patrons. Before responding, we'll leave, he said simply. But understand this, your actions today will have consequences. Word travels fast in communities like this, especially in the veteran community. You've shown your true colors, and people will remember. As the bikers began to file toward the door, each one stopped to offer Joe a word of support or encouragement. Their solidarity was both touching and powerful, a reminder that Brotherhood forged in military service could transcend surface differences and unite people in common cause. Joe, still processing this unexpected turn of events, found himself walking alongside Mike toward the exit. The morning that had begun with such hope for a peaceful breakfast had transformed into something entirely different, a moment of confrontation that revealed both the persistence of prejudice and the power of unexpected alliances. Where are you parked? Mike asked as they stepped outside into the bright morning sunlight. The The contrast between the tense atmosphere inside the cafe and the peaceful streetscape was jarring, as if they had stepped from one world into another. Joe gestured toward his modest sedan parked half a block away. "Just down there," he said. "I walked. Actually, it's not far from my house." Mike nodded, then looked back at the cafe with an expression of disgust. What happened in there was wrong on every level. "But I want you to know, it's not over. We have ways of addressing situations like this that don't involve violence but are very effective." Intrigued, Joe asked, "What do you mean?" Mike's smile was grim but determined. "Let's just say that the veteran community in this area is larger and more connected than most people realize. Word about what happened here today will spread quickly, and businesses that discriminate against veterans tend to find themselves facing challenges they never anticipated." As if summoned by Mike's words, the sound of motorcycle engines filled the air. Joe looked down the street to see additional bikers arriving, not just a few, but dozens of them, their machines gleaming in the morning sun. They parked in formation along the street, their riders dismounting with the precision of a military unit. "Friends of yours?" Joe asked, amazed by the rapid response. "Brothers," Mike corrected. "We may not all serve in the same unit anymore, but we still look out for each other. What happened to you happened to all of us." Over the next several hours, Joe watched in amazement as what had begun as a simple breakfast outing transformed into something much larger. The bikers organized themselves into a peaceful but imposing presence outside the cozy corner, their numbers swelling throughout the day as word spread through networks built on shared service and mutual support. They weren't blocking the entrance or preventing anyone from entering, but their presence sent a clear message that discrimination would not be tolerated without response. Local residents stopped to talk with the bikers, many expressing support for their cause and sharing their own stories of witnessing or experiencing discrimination in the community. Joe found himself at the center of conversations he never could have anticipated. Television news crews arrived, drawn by the unusual sight of dozens of bikers conducting a peaceful protest in small-town Tennessee. Reporters interviewed Joe about his experience, giving him a platform to share not just what had happened that morning, but his broader perspective on service, sacrifice, and the ongoing struggle for equality. "I enlisted because I believed in America's promise," Joe told one reporter, his words carrying the weight of lived experience. "I believed that if I served my country with honor, I would help create a better future for all Americans. What happened today reminds me that we still have work to do, but it also shows me that there are people willing to do that work alongside me." The story spread beyond local news, picked up by national outlets and shared thousands of times on social media. The image of elderly Black veteran being supported by a diverse group of bikers resonated with people across the country, becoming a symbol of both the persistence of discrimination and the power of solidarity to confront it. Frank, meanwhile, found himself dealing with consequences he clearly hadn't anticipated. The cafe, which had been busy that morning, saw its customer base dwindle as word spread about the incident. Reviews on social media platforms were overwhelmingly negative, and calls for boycotts began circulating through veteran organizations, civil rights groups, and community networks that extended far beyond Ashwood's borders. By afternoon, Frank's phone was ringing constantly with calls from concerned investors, suppliers threatening to terminate contracts, and community leaders demanding explanations. The simple act of discrimination that had taken less than 10 minutes to unfold was generating repercussions that would last for months, if not years. But the story didn't end with Frank's comeuppance or even with the media attention. As the day wore on, something remarkable began to happen in the streets around the cozy corner. What had started as a protest evolved into something closer to a community celebration. Local business owners began bringing coffee and sandwiches to the assembled bikers, transforming what could have been a tense standoff into an impromptu block party. Children from nearby neighborhoods came to admire the motorcycles, their eyes wide with wonder as gruff-looking veterans patiently explained the mechanics of their machines and shared stories of adventures on the open road. Mrs. Henderson, Joe's elderly neighbor, arrived carrying a cooler full of homemade lemonade and a folding chair for Joe. "You shouldn't have to stand all day at your age," she scolded gently, setting up the chair in the shade of a large oak tree. Her presence, and that of other community members who came to show their support, demonstrated that the fight against discrimination wasn't limited to veterans or any single group. It was a community-wide effort involving people of all backgrounds who believed in basic human dignity. As evening approached, Mike found Joe sitting in his chair, watching the organized chaos of the day's events with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. The young reporter who had interviewed him earlier was packing up her equipment, having captured enough footage and interviews to fill several news segments. "How are you holding up?" Mike asked, settling onto the grass beside Joe's chair with the easy informality of someone who had spent years in military barracks and field camps. Joe considered the question carefully. "Tired," he admitted, but in a good way. "I woke up this morning hoping for pancakes and coffee. Instead, I got something I didn't even know I needed." "What's that?" Joe gestured toward the assembled crowd, bikers sharing stories with local families, children playing games between the parked motorcycles, elderly residents engaged in animated conversations about community values and social progress. Proof that things can change, that people can choose to stand up instead of stand by. Mike nodded, understanding the deeper significance of what had transpired. "You know, when we first saw what was happening in there, my first instinct was to handle it the old way, with intimidation and force. But watching how you conducted yourself, seeing your dignity in the face of such disrespect, it reminded me that there are better ways to fight battles. The hardest battles are often fought with patience rather than passion." Joe reflected. "I learned that lesson many times over the years, sometimes the hard way." As if responding to some unspoken signal, the bikers began preparing to leave. Motorcycles roared to life in a carefully orchestrated sequence, the sound echoing off the buildings lining Main Street. But this wasn't a retreat or an ending, it was a transformation of energy from protest to purpose. Before departing, each biker made a point of saying goodbye to Joe personally. Some offered simple words of support, others shared contact information and invitations to veteran gatherings, and a few presented him with patches or pins representing their units or motorcycle clubs. By the time the last bike had departed, Joe had accumulated a small collection of mementos representing a brotherhood he had never known existed. Mike was the last to leave, but not before making Joe a promise. "This isn't over," he said, clasping Joe's hand in a firm grip. "We're going to make sure every veteran-owned business in the region knows about what happened today. We're going to create a network of places where people like you, people like all of us, know they'll be welcome. And if we find other establishments practicing discrimination?" Joe asked. Mike's smile was both determined and slightly mischievous. "Well, let's just say that the veteran community has a long memory and a lot of creative ways to express disapproval. Legal, peaceful ways, of course." As the evening settled over Ashwood, Joe found himself walking home along the same streets he had traveled that morning. But everything felt different now. The same neighbors were tending their gardens and walking their dogs. The same houses lined the familiar blocks. But Joe's place in this community had fundamentally shifted. Word of the day's events had spread through the neighborhood networks that bind small towns together. People who had previously offered only polite nods now stopped to engage him in conversation, sharing their own stories of witnessing discrimination or expressing support for the stand he and his unlikely allies had taken. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been sweeping her steps that morning, was waiting on her front porch as Joe approached. "Senor Joe," she called out, using a form of address that conveyed both respect and warmth. "I heard about what happened today. I want you to know that my family and I support what you did." Joe paused at her gate, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez. It means more than you know. My husband, he served in Vietnam too," she continued, her accent adding musical qualities to her words. "Different unit, different time, but same war. He says veterans should look out for each other, regardless of color or country of origin." These conversations, repeated dozens of times during his walk home, painted a picture of a community grappling with its own conscience. Not everyone supported Joe's cause. He could see that in the closed curtains of some houses, the averted gazes of certain neighbors, but enough did to create hope for meaningful change. Back in his own house, Joe sat in his favorite armchair and contemplated the extraordinary day. The medals on his jacket caught the lamplight, each one representing not just his own service but the collective sacrifice of all those who had worn the uniform in defense of freedom. Today, that sacrifice had found new meaning and new purpose. The phone rang throughout the evening, calls from veterans organizations wanting to hear his story firsthand, invitations to speak at military events, and offers of support from civil rights groups. Each conversation reinforced the lesson that individual acts of courage could create ripple effects extending far beyond their original context. 3 weeks later, Joe received an unexpected visitor. Sarah, the young waitress from the cozy corner, stood nervously on his front porch, holding an envelope in her trembling hands. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been wanting to come see you since that day. I owe you an apology." Joe invited her inside, offering her a seat in his living room and a glass of iced tea. As she settled into the chair across from him, he could see she was struggling with emotions that had been building for weeks. "You have nothing to apologize for," Joe said gently. "You were just doing your job." Sarah shook her head vigorously. "No, I should have stood up for you. I should have told Frank he was wrong. I should have quit right there instead of just standing and watching." "Sometimes it takes time to find our courage," Joe replied with the wisdom of someone who had learned that lesson many times over. "The important thing is that you found it eventually." Sarah opened the envelope she had been clutching and withdrew a letter written on official-looking letterwork. "I did quit," she said, her voice growing stronger, "the day after the incident. But more importantly, I filed a formal complaint with the State Civil Rights Commission. This is a copy of their response. They're opening an official investigation into the cafe's practices." Joe read the letter with growing amazement. The investigation would examine not just his experience but patterns of discrimination that might have affected other customers. If violations were found, the cafe could face significant fines and mandatory training programs for all employees. "There's more," Sarah continued, reaching back into the envelope. "I've been talking to other servers and kitchen staff from restaurants around town. We're organizing something we're calling the Dignity Initiative, a commitment by food service workers to refuse to participate in discrimination against any customer, regardless of what their managers might order." The document she handed Joe was a pledge signed by more than 30 restaurant employees from establishments throughout Ashwood. It committed them to treating all customers with respect and to reporting discrimination when they witnessed it. The initiative had already been endorsed by the local Chamber of Commerce and was being considered for adoption by restaurant associations in neighboring counties. "You did all this because of what happened that morning?" Joe asked, clearly moved by the scope of Sarah's response. "I did it because of how you handled yourself that morning," Sarah corrected. "Your dignity in the face of such ugliness made me realize that I have a choice in these situations. I can be part of the problem by staying silent, or I can be part of the solution by taking action." Over the following months, the ripple effects of that Sunday morning continued to spread. The cozy corner eventually closed, unable to recover from the combination of negative publicity and economic boycotts. The building was purchased by a consortium of local veterans who transformed it into a community center offering services to military families and hosting events that brought together people from across Ashwood's increasingly diverse population. Mike and his fellow bikers made good on their promise to create a network of veteran-friendly businesses. What started as a simple list shared among motorcycle clubs evolved into a comprehensive directory of establishments throughout Tennessee and neighboring states that actively welcomed military veterans and their families. The directory included not just restaurants and hotels but also mechanics, healthcare providers, legal services, and other businesses owned by veterans or committed to serving the veteran community. Joe found himself becoming an unlikely community leader, invited to speak at schools about military service and civil rights, consulted by local government officials on issues affecting elderly residents, and sought out by young veterans looking for mentorship and guidance. His quiet dignity and thoughtful approach to activism made him a respected voice in discussions about progress and reconciliation. But perhaps the most significant change was in Joe himself. the isolation and resignation that had characterized his daily routine before that fateful Sunday morning had been replaced by engagement and purpose. He joined the local veterans organization, volunteered at the community center that had replaced the cozy corner, and began working with civil rights groups to address discrimination in housing and employment. 1 year after the incident, Joe stood before a packed auditorium at the community center, delivering the keynote address at Ashwood's first annual Unity Day celebration. The audience was a remarkable cross-section of the community, veterans and civilians, young and old, representing the full spectrum of racial and ethnic backgrounds that now called Ashwood home. A year ago, Joe began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed auditorium. I walked into a restaurant hoping for nothing more than breakfast. I left having experienced something I've encountered too many times in my 8 decades of life, the pain of discrimination, the sting of being judged by my appearance rather than my character. He paused, looking out at the faces before him, some familiar, others new to the community, all united in their commitment to creating a more inclusive society. But I also discovered something that morning that gave me hope I hadn't felt in years. I learned that when good people see injustice, they have the power to stand against it. I learned that brotherhood and solidarity can emerge from the most unexpected places. And I learned that individual acts of courage can inspire collective action that transforms entire communities. The applause that greeted his words was sustained and heartfelt. But Joe wasn't finished. The fight for dignity, for respect, for the simple right to be treated as a fellow human being, that fight isn't won in a single morning or even in a single year. It's an ongoing effort that requires all of us to remain vigilant, to speak out when we see wrong being done, and to actively work to create the kind of community we want to live in. He gestured toward Mike, who was sitting in the front row with several of his fellow bikers, now regular volunteers at the community center. I've learned that heroes don't always look like we expect them to. Sometimes they wear leather jackets and ride motorcycles. Sometimes they're young waitresses who find their courage after witnessing injustice. Sometimes they're elderly neighbors who offer lemonade and moral support. The common thread isn't their appearance or their background, it's their willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. As Joe concluded his speech and the audience rose in a standing ovation, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with such a simple desire for pancakes and coffee. The discrimination he had faced that morning had been painful and demoralizing, but it had also been the catalyst for changes he could never have imagined. The young soldier who had enlisted decades earlier with hope in his heart had aged into a man who had seen that hope tested, challenged, and ultimately vindicated the promise of America that all people could be treated with dignity and respect. That service to country would be honored regardless of race or background. That communities could choose progress over prejudice had proven itself true, not because discrimination had disappeared, but because good people were willing to fight against it. Outside the community center, as families gathered for the Unity Day festival that would continue late into the evening, Joe found himself surrounded by the extended family he had gained through that morning's confrontation. Mike and his biker brothers, Sarah and her fellow restaurant workers, Mrs. Henderson and the neighbors who had become true friends, veterans from multiple generations and conflicts who had found common cause in their commitment to service and justice. The sight of children playing games between the vendor booths, teenagers from different backgrounds working together as volunteers, and elderly residents sharing stories with newcomers to the community painted a picture of the future Joe had always hoped for but had sometimes doubted he would live to see. As the sun set over Ashwood, casting long shadows across the festival grounds, Joe Thompson, veteran, survivor, and now community elder, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to see his faith in human goodness validated by the actions of unexpected heroes who had chosen courage over comfort, solidarity over silence, and love over hate. The breakfast he had sought that Sunday morning had become something far more nourishing, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope could emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that the promise of America lived not in grand gestures or political speeches, but in the daily choices made by ordinary people to treat each other with dignity, respect, and compassion. In the distance, The sound of motorcycle engines could be heard as a group of bikers prepared for their evening ride, not as a statement of protest, but as a celebration of the freedom they had all served to protect and the community they had helped to transform. They rode not just as individuals but as brothers and sisters united in purpose, carrying with them the knowledge that they had been part of something greater than themselves. And in his modest house on Maple Street, Joe Thompson would sleep peacefully that night, surrounded by the medals and memories of a lifetime of service, but sustained by something even more precious, the knowledge that his country's promise was still alive, still worth fighting for, and still capable of inspiring people to be better than their prejudices, stronger than their fears, and more compassionate than their differences. The breakfast had been delayed by a year, but the meal that finally nourished his soul had been worth the wait.